Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Enterprise AI Show. I'm your host, Brian Gracely, and today we're going to dive into the third of my top 10 enterprise AI questions that I think every CIO and every leader probably should be asking themselves, because I don't think we have very good answers for them today. Obviously, the first two, if you've been following along, how much does token consumption across the enterprise actually cost versus being subsidized? So, we've seen that start to become more and more of a discussion, especially as we're starting to see things like the IPOs for OpenAI and Anthropic start to, see the light of day, and some of their numbers are coming forward. The second one we had was, how will team collaboration evolve with enterprise AI? We talked a little bit about, how teams are gonna work together, what has to evolve in terms of setting goals and all of those sorts of things, timelines and other stuff. And today we're going to dive a little bit into, kind of what's going to be the incentive to get teammates to share their learning curves. And we're going to dive a little bit more into that after the break. One other thing you may be noticing if you're picking this up on your feed, you might be saying, hey, why am I getting the show on a Friday? We made the decision to move the show from Wednesday and Sunday to Wednesday and Friday. Part of that is, we were finding ourselves doing too many shows on the weekend, and just, with families and all, that's not necessarily desirable to do. So we have no problem kind of switching that. And the other part was, for folks, a lot of folks tell us they do listen to the show on the weekends. We wanted to give you a little bit of a head start to be able to have, the entire weekend to find some time to dive into it. So whether you are, walking or exercising or mowing the grass or just, out on a family trip or whatever you're doing, I wanted to give you a little more time for that. So we're going to move the show from Wednesday will still be the anchor. Friday will be sort of the second show. All the other stuff about weekend perspectives and all that other kind of stuff. Friday's the weekend as far as we're concerned anyway. So shouldn't be a problem. But we're going to dive into all that right after the break. Today's show is sponsored by Nasuni. There's a growing gap in AI right now between what's possible in theory and what successfully works at scale inside an enterprise. The difference comes down to unstructured file data. Many AI initiatives struggle because the file data they depend on is scattered, unstructured, and disconnected from where and how work actually happens. Nasuni changes that. It brings your unstructured file data into a single, secure foundation so AI, both generative and agentic, can access it with the context, governance, and performance it needs in production. Bring AI to where your unstructured data lives. See what it takes to activate your data for AI and request a demo at nasuni.com/AI. This episode is brought to you by Outshift, Cisco's incubation engine. AI agents today operate in silos, limiting their potential. Scaling up models isn't enough. We need to scale out. Like humans did 70,000 years ago, agents must share knowledge, goals, and innovation to evolve. Outshift by Cisco is building the Internet of Cognition, transforming isolated AI systems into orchestrated superintelligence. This open infrastructure enables agents and humans to share intent, context, and reasoning. The cognition evolution for agents is here. Learn more at outshift.com. That's outshift.com. Today's show is sponsored by ShareGate. You're out of time. Copilot needs to be deployed ASAP, but your tenant really isn't ready for it. Years of data, permissions, and users lurk in its shadows, ready to be exposed by AI. ShareGate Protect sees it all, so you can find the exposure risks, fix them fast, and deploy AI with confidence. Microsoft 365 Governance, they've got this. Learn more at sharegate.com/protect. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to dive into the third thing I had on my list as far as, top 10 things that I think, anybody who's thinking about enterprise AI, whether it's the CIO, CISO, leaders of organizations, team managers, those sorts of things, probably should be thinking about. And today I want to dive into kind of this question I wrote down, which is, what will be the incentive to share AI across learning curves with teammates, right? So for example, and I've seen this kind of with my own work, as well as, just talking to a lot of different people is, we're seeing various people, there's kind of a hierarchy of how this works. How sort of the first step of it is, does your company, allow AI to even exist within your organization? Do they allow the tools in there, or is this entirely a shadow operation? Which, and I know from talking to lots of different companies, that's still kind of a spectrum there, right? We're seeing more and more companies who are bringing some sort of AI tool and are allowing some things, but still lots of restrictions, which leads to a lot of shadow activities, which Again, the more shadow you have, the more sort of things that won't necessarily be aligned to some sort of corporate standard. And again, there's pros and cons to that. Then obviously the second piece of it is you're going to have, as we've talked about a lot, you're going to have different people depending on whether or not they want to adopt it or are excited about adopting it or are, kind of recognizing that might be sort of where the future of their job is going, are going to be more aggressive at adopting it. And then you're going to have people who are, either just going to passively kind of deal with it, they're going to ignore it, or they're going to actively sort of fight against using it. And we're seeing that, kind of in a lot of different ways too. And again, pros and cons to all those opinions, not necessarily trying to drive that out, but as you have sort of a mix of rapid adopters versus sort of laggards, as we've seen with every technology, you're going to have people who are figuring things out faster and faster. So whether they are doing development assistant work, whether they're doing knowledge work, whether they are doing creative work, whatever it might be, research, you're then going to have people that are going to figure out these tools, figure out how to make them useful, figure out how to make them, what they do in their job better in many cases. And then the question becomes, okay, you've taken the time to figure those things out. How much time should you be spending trying to help your colleagues and workers? And then I guess the last piece will be, as far as if I were trying to make this into a layer cake, the fourth layer is going to sort of be, management who, whether they allow this as a policy or the policy sort of running roughshod over them, are going to start looking for, some sort of best practice, some sort of consistency that they can drive across the business, because then that allows them to, as they're onboarding new employees, go, hey, this is our procedure for leveraging these new tools. Or if they are, looking for ways to, become more efficient at what they do, try and drive the tool to help whatever task they're trying to do. So, we're going to see kind of a lot of different things, but, I started thinking about, okay, as that problem sort of exists, which I know it does exist. And again, I've seen it within, various organizations I've talked to where you'll kind of have different people in the room who go, yep, we use it every day. It's my go-to for what I do. Again, whether it's, just using one of the tools, a Claude, a Copilot, a Gemini, or whatever it might be, or, they built some of their own types of things. And so the first thing that I think we're going to have to kind of figure out, and this is becoming, more and more of a topic and a headline, is how are we going to measure AI adoption success, right? Is it going to be based on the number of workloads? So our customer is going to sort of go, oh, I've embedded AI into 50 tasks or 50 applications or 35 workflows or whatever they do, right? So is it going to be sort of a raw number, right? That looks more at like not the people in the business, but sort of the activities of the business. The second piece could very well be financial metrics. So, what's our overall spend? Are we spending too much? Are we spending in line with what's expected for our type of industry or our size company? Are we spending in ways that we think are going to help us accelerate our business at a different number of worker level or price level or velocity level, whatever that I think might be? It might be, based on sort of the classic ROI. We spent this much. What did we get out of it? That's obviously proving to be a little more difficult, especially in the enterprise. We've seen, plenty of reports of, less than stellar ROI for those that have tried to measure it. Is it going to be measured based on cost savings? So, once you figure out those workflows, are you going to start figuring out, okay, well, I did those and now those workflows take me 10 minutes as opposed to 2 hours, and I can start to figure out cost savings and things along those lines, or something else, right? So that'll be one way I think that we'll see people look at it from a financial metrics perspective. They could very well look at it from a perspective of like speed, right? Are we getting faster? Whether that is faster in developing features and capabilities to enhance the products that we deliver to our customers, whether it's faster in, maybe it's, faster in resolving, vulnerabilities and bugs within your organization so that you can stay more secure. Maybe it's faster in, creating ways to, build out the paperwork that's needed to move a drug from phase A to phase B in drug discovery. And, so those things along those lines, I think, speed oftentimes is a metric, right? We're doing things considerably faster, or, we're reducing the number of tasks to do the same amounts of stuff. Or we can start measuring it sort of in people level things, right? The number of people that are using the tools, how much more efficient those people are getting, right? What sort of output do we get from those folks as we often, try and measure as new technologies coming along. So I think the first piece of this incentivized to share with people is just having some idea of like, assuming they were doing some sort of sharing or working together or trying to collaborate with each other so that the team collectively can get better, how would you even go about measuring that? So I think that's the first piece of this. The second piece right now, and this is a difficult thing, as we oftentimes sort of talk about things in theory, and then people will sort of go, well, okay, well that sounds cool, or that sounds like where we'd like to get to. How do I do that? And this is where right now the AI tools they're very individual centric, right? I know we've talked about this quite a few times with Brandon Witchard as he come on for AI News of the Month and sharing some of his experience. But right now, the way that people are interacting with AI for the most part is very individualistic. So whether it's you and your chatbot session, whether you've built out sort of a swarm of agents to go do a task that you can spider out and do across multiple functional type of things, whether you've built something like a Gemini gem or a notebook or something like that, notebook LLM, and those are things that you might have built, and those are a little easier to share than some of the other things. It's very hard to share a chatbot session. There's very hard to sort of we'll see people share agents, but still, agents are still sort of in the building phase. We haven't reached that yet. And then you get into skills, and skills, can be more easily shared. We're going to start seeing, as we've seen with, many of the announcements over the last 6 months, companies are going to start building, skill repositories, self-service things to get access to skills. And that's kind of the classic enterprise way of doing it, is let's build some sort of portal, some sort of repository, some sort of, factory, if you will, whatever it might be, that says, well, here's all the stuff that you can pick from, right? The equivalent of like, hey, whatever you're going to need to do to work on your house, you can go to the Home Depot. There's plenty of aisles full of stuff. You figure that out. And so, that mechanism is still very individualistic. It's still very difficult, for example, to say, hey, I worked on this task and here's, all the prompts, here's all of the output, here's all of the, that's still sort of a challenging thing to do. There aren't, there's not the most obvious sort of share button. And then even when there are ways to go, well, if you had a central repository similar to, you're just using, GitLab or something, the way that software works in terms of sharing and forking branches and sort of that's not a natural mechanism, sort of non-software centric people, right? So overall, those are difficult. I think so we talked about the machinery to go about sharing is still very difficult. So that makes it partially difficult. And then the experience is still very non-deterministic. And by that, I mean, yes, you can ask two different things, the same prompt, and you're going to get different answers. But, it's also, we're not talking about people just, sharing a spreadsheet and being like, oh, did you run this function? Oh, okay. You should have gotten this answer, right? Or here's the data set, pull it into your tool, your spreadsheet, and you're going to get, this sort of view of what the data looks like. That's very, very different when you're doing work with generative AI and you're going, hey, I want you to, prepare a presentation for our big customer meeting, or I want you to prepare a presentation to go off and sell a new idea. That process, whether you're writing something or whether you're creating content for it or images or charts or whatever, that sort of falls into the area of like, well, everybody does it a little bit differently. And especially if, your company's organizational culture is not really rigid about how they do that, that experience is going to be non-deterministic, right? Just the same way that everything in AI is sort of non-deterministic. And it's going to be very difficult without some sort of like centralized enterprise harness around all the tools that you use with, the guidance that they want to make consistent things. And so if they're not consistent and one of you and your coworker are both tasked with sort of doing the same thing, you're very likely, you may come up with similar answers, but you probably got there in different ways. And then when you go about saying, well, okay, let's bring on a third person to the project, a fifth person, a 10th person, the things that they're going to be able to choose from are going to be a variety of things. And so that becomes, again, difficult to begin sharing, building consistency, building repeatable processes. Because again, the tools right now are very individual centric, and the sharing piece of it, the collaboration piece, is sort of an afterthought that people are figuring out ways to sort of hack around stuff. Yes, I could, export it to a PDF and then put it somewhere. I could, remember my prompts and share them through Slack or however you go about doing that, but still not easy to do. And then the third thing I had on my list was, the motivation to share, with your coworkers is still sort of unknown, right? So, you think about this sort of pre-AI and you go, okay, what was the motivation if you were good at your job to necessarily share with other people? Well, for the most part, the system and the incentives in the system weren't necessarily there. I mean, that, they might have said, well, as a team or as a company, we have some goals, and the goals, might be team oriented. But then we measured people on an individual basis, right? And we stacked ranked people on an individual basis. So there's always going to be a certain amount of, while the lead of the company might say, well, I want you all to work together. We're one team, we're one company. That's not the way incentives tend to work. They don't work in terms of promotions. They don't work in terms of providing equity to to individuals or recognition to individuals. So we've already had a problem in which, if you don't have your incentives right, if the incentives are sort of willy-nilly at the company level, that you may not necessarily be able to impact those, but at an individual level, you're being stack ranked, you're going to figure out a way to try and get as high on that stack ranking as possible. And that's been the case, pre-AI and will still continue. So the question sort of becomes, how do you start to frame this in a way that, is the goal to say, hey, once a few people in the team start figuring out AI tools, I'm going to sort of slow them down and ask them to sort of work with the rest of the team so that they can get to a next level of a baseline. Maybe you are, right? Maybe that's one of the things that you'll sort of encourage for the team, and that becomes its own challenge, right? Are those people, do they work well with others? Are they good at sort of training other people on what they do? But then, the other piece of this is, we are at a stage right now where we're seeing, unfortunately, more and more, layoffs happening or implications or, kind of hinting around that, hey, AI is going to help us, right size our headcount, and, without really a whole lot of details about why those things happen. And so, when the motivation is going on like that, and you're putting people's jobs at risk or their stability at risk, their ability to provide for their families at risk, or at least you're sort of hinting that that could happen. We sort of want to look like this other company that arbitrarily just laid off a whole bunch of people. You're not going to necessarily find a way to get somebody who is, really kind of rocking and rolling, really kind of expanding their capabilities because they've learned some stuff with AI to necessarily want to share with other people, right? Because in their mind, yes, it would be great for the team to do well. And maybe there is a way that you've motivated the team or you're measuring the team. But at the same time, they're also going to go, hey, I'm going to sit down with my boss one-on-one, or I'm going to sit there in the stack ranking at the end of the year, every 6 months or quarter, or however you work it. And you're going to want to come with the best portfolio of whatever work you did, right? You're going to want to kind of recognize that what you did was the best that you could do, but also hopefully is, in many cases, the way the motivation works better than your coworkers, right? So that's going to be another sort of barrier to making this work. And then the third piece that's going to get really interesting is, we're starting to see this, and again, it's really still kind of an early thing, but we're starting to see buzz about it. This idea of, maybe we just remove the people in the middle, remove the managers, or remove the, the counters, as the guys over on Software Defined Talk mentioned this week or last week. Once that starts to happen, and you've got sort of, what maybe you used to have a team of people, 10, 12, 15 individual contributors. Then you had a manager, then you had a director, and then maybe you had, a vice president. Maybe that organization spread out over like 500 people. Well, if you get rid of a layer of that or two layers of that in terms of the management organization, now, you're going to have that top level person, probably that VP level person, who their level of what they're being asked to do is always results driven, right? It's very, it's going to be very much like, here's big number. How am I going to reach that big number? All that sort of stuff. And they're going to be looking for individuals that sort of stand out, because now they're managing 100 people, 150 people, 200 people. And, they're not going to have time to sort of be like, well, what's your motivation for doing well? Let me help you plan your career growth. They're just going to go, here's a bunch of work to do. And, whoever does it the best, does it the fastest, takes on more of it. That's how things are going to kind of get rewarded. So, I think as I'm sort of wrapping this up and I'm thinking through those three things in terms of how would we measure success, are the right tools in place to be able to even start to do these things? And then the other thing around motivation and the challenges right now that are happening with motivation at the individual contributor level, or even, probably to a certain extent at the manager or director level, none of those things are necessarily lining up with the idea that you're going to get great collaboration start to happen. What you're going to see is the people that, are willing to spend some time, maybe some extra time after work or on the weekends or whatever, getting better at these AI tools. We're going to try and find ways for themselves to stand out, more so than maybe they are going to be for workers. Because again, we've eroded over time people's desire to be loyal to their company. And so they're going to look at those skills and say, well, these skills are transferable. If I can do it here, I can go somewhere else and do it. And I know they're gonna be looking for people that can show their skills from an AI perspective. So I think we're in for some challenges with this stuff. It feels like maybe more so than some of the other tools and capabilities we've seen in the past. And I think it's going to be an interesting thing for people to figure out both how do the tools evolve, right? So do the tools evolve to become more collaborative, more sharing, more, around team level projects or team level skills? And then also, how are you going to figure out the motivation? Because at the end of the day, if you can't figure out the motivation, it's like everybody says with a sales compensation plan. You show me your sales compensation plan, and I'll show you what people are going to be motivated to sell, because they're going to find the ways to make the most money for themselves, which may or may not align to what your priorities were at a company level, a group level, a team level, and so forth. So anyways, would love to hear people's feedback. How are you doing it in your company? What struggles you're having in your company? Would love to hear your actual, results, your feedback. What are you struggling with? What experiments are you trying to sort of make that happen? So anyways, with that, we will wrap it up, and hope you enjoy this. Hopefully, if you're picking it up on a Friday, leads to a good weekend. And so with that, we'll wrap it up. We'll talk to you next week.
Thanks for listening. Check us out at theenterpriseaishow.com for past shows, newsletters, and all things enterprise AI.